What you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences. And I've always sort of found you would see things that you would not automatically have come across.
Hello and welcome to the Parliamentary Review podcast, the podcast that has a soft spot for raising standards. I'm Jonathan White, and in each episode I'm joined by directors, CEOs, CFOs, government ministers, chairmen, presidents, maybe one day even the Prince of Wales. We don't mind waiting, Your Highness. We know you don't either. The aim is to discover who these people are, the people who get up each morning and make Britain work. We discuss everything from the likelihood of Germany avoiding another recession to the latest advancements in curing clinical depression, and of course, the innovation and success in the country that make it all worthwhile in the end. We also get their take on the current political and economic state of the country. Later on in this episode, you'll have the chance to hear our exclusive interview with Lord Pickles, former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Chairman of the Conservative Party, and of course, current co-chairman of the Parliamentary Review. But for now, we're joined by Elly McFahn, the Managing Director of Brio Leisure. Based in Chester, Elly joined Brio as Managing Director in 2011 and, as you'll hear, is passionate about well-being and the integration of public sector leisure services and sits on the Borough Health and Wellbeing Board. Brio Leisure is the highly successful result of an innovative experiment in 2011 to set up a community interest company to deliver affordable leisure opportunities for the people of West Cheshire. Most recently, they have been listed on the London Stock Exchange 1000 Companies to Inspire Britain, and in July, we also won the UK Active Outstanding Organisation of the Year award. We find out more now. Elly, welcome.
Good morning, Jonathan.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Now, I know it's been a few months since Brio has been in the review. What has the centre and the team been up to since?
Well, blimey, nothing stops in the leisure industry, and we're always striving onwards and upwards and forward, and I think everything that we talked about in the Parliamentary Review I think it was about 18 months ago now, is still very, very apparent, really, in terms of our focus of work and delivery. Health and wellbeing remains absolutely primary to everything we do and is an underlying stream for all of our business delivery, really, in terms of the borough that we service. We've got a borough in Cheshire West that's really diverse, over 335,000 in the unitary authority, and we've got rural deprivation, we've got urban deprivation, we've got quite an ageing population and some real challenges around obesity, particularly for young people as well. A lot of those are not dissimilar to sort of national statistics, but we remain focused on everything we can do to deliver services to meet those broader agendas.
Exceptionally busy and with such a diverse clientele. Now, I think it might be a good place to start here, Elly. I know Brio Leisure was set up as a so-called a community interest company, and it's been a highly successful model. Now, I know a lot of listeners probably won't be too familiar with the concept. Would you perhaps mind talking us through the model itself and what advantages you can reap from it?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I mean, a community interest company is really what it says on the tin. It is there for the community. It's absolutely not for profit. It is a company limited by guarantee. We've got an independent board that sits on that with a high range of skill sets from a range of sort of industry areas that are key to the model. The company is actually owned outright by Cheshire West and Chester Council, which is slightly interesting in sort of leisure delivery nationally. There are other community interest company models utilised for leisure delivery elsewhere, but they don't tend to be owned by the local authority. The reason why Cheshire West and Chester wanted to retain ownership of the company was because obviously with the political climate every 4 years changing locally and then itself aligning to national politics, it wanted to make sure that it had a business model that it could totally I'm losing the plot now. So it could totally reflect what was happening currently at that moment in time within the area. You often see elsewhere contracts that are let sort of 10 and 15 years, but if there's not some cohesive mechanism within the contract to align it to what's happening locally, there is always a danger that that contract will just deliver what it was set out to do at the outset, at the start of the contract, and actually when you're sort of 5-10 years in, and locally the world may have changed with you, then obviously that can diversify and to move away from the purposes of the local office. So in our instance, it's a really interesting model which consistently continues to realign itself to what's happening locally in Cheshire West and Chester.
I think it's so exceptionally important, given, and the record shows it in terms of how successful you have been locally. But I know, especially in a place like Cheshire West and Chester, it is a marginal council, and you have so many complaints from other bodies that perhaps when the council does change hands, then the plans change so drastically that you're unable to have a long-term plan. But I think given that yourselves there are able to do that, I think is it until 2030 the contract, it does give you that great leisure in that sense. And today, we know that you've embraced the public health challenges that the community faces. You were talking about at the beginning. I remember you spoke in the article including delivering 8,000 health interventions in 2017 alone. What will you be focusing on in the year ahead in terms of about those challenges?
Yeah, you're absolutely right with that, and the health challenges, particularly since the publication of the 10-year NHS plan as well, and I think that's really focused the mind on the continued delivery around stop smoking, weight management, cardiac conditions, and that broader preventative agenda around as people move toward older age, that we can do things to help them be motivated to change their lifestyle before it gets to a point when they actually need to enter into some sort of pathway of medical care. So there's a real focus on that. Locally, I sit on our Health and Wellbeing Board, which is a statutory function, and there's been an awful lot of work locally going on to redefine the strategy of our Health and Wellbeing Board, and which sees a much closer coming together of NHS and local authority strategy, which I think is going to be extremely helpful going forward for all of the agencies that are involved in that, in terms of delivering a more cohesive and joined up approach. And I do think cohesion and prevention and doing those in partnership is absolutely critical to how we move forward what are very testing public sector budgets at this moment in time. We're particularly looking at place-based service provision, so really defining what people need in the place that they live. That differs from town to town, so we have a number of leisure centres across a number of differing towns within the borough, but each of the demographics of those towns varies tremendously. The age of the population, the number of children living there, the deprivation in each of those towns, it's all very variant. So we've been doing an awful lot of preparatory work around unpicking the demographics that sit behind that, using Acorn, which obviously councils use and is used nationally, using internal data from customers that we see coming through the door and telling us about the services they receive, and then overlaying that with joint strategic needs assessment data through health pathways, and then pulling all of that together to redefine services that people want in communities that make it easy for them to get to. And I think sometimes, we have leisure centres in there within a 10-minute drive time of people's house, but when people are living busy lives, looking after children, they're a sandwich generation, they've got elderly parents, it's really important to find something that fits with their day-to-day living, something that they can find that's motivational and that they can do on a regular basis to look after their health.
And I think, certainly the key takeaway from all that, I'd say, is that is certainly your ability and necessity sometimes, I think, to use, and you mentioned Acorn, of course, the listeners, segmentation tool, which very handily and usefully segments the country's population into different demographic types. And that having that knowledge, local knowledge, is so important, being able to plan your year and years ahead and how you tackle those issues. I thought it might be interesting for listeners especially to know, when you do have a young population, especially from deprived areas where childhood obesity especially can be an issue, as well as the issues related to over 75s, whether that's dementia, stroke, or indeed loneliness. How is it you find best to deal with both of those very different challenges at the same time? And perhaps if you could focus on one first and the other, that would be great to know.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right there. If I focus on sort of older people first, so we've got an increasing demographic there. I think we're going to exceed 50,000 75 plus within the next 10 to 15 years. So we've had a piece of work undertaken locally as well around the building, the place-based need within Borough, which tells us how many leisure centres and sports halls and so forth we need. But actually getting to those individuals through pathways where they feel safe and secure is really key. And digitally, obviously, we're in a world of digitalisation nowadays, and that's a cheaper and more effective way to reach people. But at the same time, that perversely can impact on social isolation when you've got a whole cohort of a generation who maybe don't utilise it in the vein that it's used up and down the country nowadays for the younger population. So we see partnerships, particularly with older people, as absolutely critical. We work very, very closely with GPs, with every single one of our GPs across the borough, to understand and access their cohorts of patients that are coming through and giving recommendations to come into leisure activities. There's a lot of focus around social prescribing. That's a national drive, as well as we're doing that locally. So again, somebody popping into the doctor who maybe is going because they're socially isolated, rather than getting some prescription, they're passed over to our service, whereby they can come and have a cup of coffee in a community centre and think about an activity. We also work really closely with our adult social care provider. We referred to it in the review of Vivo Care Choices, and all the daycare services are now, over time, where it's appropriate, being located into leisure centre environments, and we're currently exploring at the moment an option to move dementia daycare into a leisure centre, which would obviously give those individuals who are receiving sort of isolated services in an independent site the opportunity to then sample leisure activities and come with their families and build up a whole relationship really with that leisure centre, in terms of coming and using everything that goes on it, or even if they just want to come for a cup of coffee at the end of the day.
I think it's so important to underline the importance between physical activity of any kind and good mental health, no matter what age you are.
Absolutely. And I mean, we've done some work previously around understanding people's motivations, particularly with mental health, and even to walk over the threshold into a building that you're not familiar with is a massively challenging position to be in, let alone actually undertaking an activity once you're through the door. So we've done some little things to try and encourage and break down the barriers around that. So online you can go on and you can look at videos around what it looks like and feels like to drive into a leisure centre, to park up, to walk through the door, to speak to somebody on reception, to understand how it is you might get into the swimming pool or into the gym. So it's the little things, I think, that matter just as much as sort of the bigger things around trying to work to people's motivations to do that physical activity. We've also got a number of role models as well that we're working with to showcase how you can be much older and still being really, really physically active. A lady who's volunteered to work with us on that is 73, and she's bench pressing, 2 kilos of weight, just to show that can happen. And actually she's changed her life around, and she's stymied the early onset of diabetes in her life through weight loss and physical activity. So role models as well, and testimonials are really key to engagement. And
it's so important to have people like that to inspire others. And perhaps looking at the younger end of the spectrum, obviously, and it's not... so many complex issues when it comes to childhood obesity, especially. What's the best way to address this at the minute? Not just perhaps for yourselves individually, but looking more broadly as a country.
I think it's a variant-pronged approach to it, really. You've obviously got some people who have families and the motivation to want to do activity, but it's finding the right activity for each individual. There's certainly not a one-size-fits-all, and about finding that in communities and settings where they can access it without having to necessarily get in the car. I mean, again, climate change is another massive issue, both locally and for the country. And I think having things on children's doorsteps, it fits in with planning. It's about having cycle routes, it's about having walking groups linked to new development, it's about having play areas on people's doorsteps, it's about a safe setting so that you can go out and be out at night and your parents aren't concerned as to where you're going to be. It's about knowing if you do go to the local leisure centre that you're safe when you're in there. There are supervised organised sessions with people that are suitably qualified to look after you. Particularly for Brio, I think it's about us working very closely with schools. We already have a really good relationship with most of the schools in Borough. Most children will go through a statutory swimming pathway with their local leisure provider, and it's how you develop and build upon that. And some of the children would never even come into the site apart from that one touch point when the school is bringing them for that swim lesson. So it's how we then develop that going forward. In terms of the health pathway, children will undertake health needs a weight management programme when they're in year 1 and then when they're in year 6 again, and that's the statistics the government use obviously to measure child obesity. We provide an intervention to families at that point. So once the child has been weighed and measured by the organisation delivering that, there's a Brio support offering there for that family and for that child to come and do activity, so that they can be supported as a unit as a whole. It's not just about supporting the child, it's about supporting the unit that surrounds that child.
Now, you've referenced a fair number already, but I just wanted to bring it up specifically. You stressed the importance of working with so many different partners around the borough, including, for example, well, you haven't mentioned Macmillan Cancer Support. And how important are these partnerships in delivering good health to those that might be hardest to reach, but also those that need it most?
Fundamentally, they're critical. We can't reach everybody as an organisation at all, and even if we can reach them, we might be reaching people in a way that isn't quite comforting enough for them, particularly if their motivational confidence is such that they might not be thinking about looking after themselves and their health and wellbeing. So it's absolutely critical. There's other organisations, particularly around the third sector as well as charities, on the ground who are that trusted body that is already in contact with the end user. And as we develop relationships with those partner organisations, and our team of staff are going in and working and supporting closely alongside that's how we develop infrastructure with other organisations to get people to be physically active, either through what we do in Brio or just supporting them and providing them with advice and guidance and develop confidence to go and do something elsewhere that might be right for them. So at the end of the day, at the Macmillan programme, a lot of people in that have cited gardening as something that's absolutely important to them, far more so than going into a leisure centre. They've maybe undergone a journey of chemotherapy and they're following a rehabilitation pathway, and actually what they want to do is they want to stay at home and they want some help, but they want help locally and they want to be out in the fresh air. So gardening is the perfect solution in that instance. That contract, we've put people in to support them in enabling them to undertake gardening, rather than actually saying, well, actually you need to come along to a leisure centre and do a class, because that wouldn't be right for that individual.
Now, I'm conscious of the time actually here. Well, perhaps stepping back a bit, perhaps from the borough itself, and with your years of experience in the industry, what would you say are the main challenges that the sector's facing at the moment more broadly, especially in the medium term?
I think in the medium term, and there's a number of challenges. I think financially, leisure is a non-statutory service, so there's always a challenge to ensure that it gets prioritisation within a very testing and challenging local authority budget. I think the understanding around preventative health and the role that physical activity, health and wellbeing plays needs to be unpicked, I think, going forward. I attended a very inspiring conference actually 2 weeks ago through UK Active, its Leisure Summit, with presentations from Dame Tanny Gray-Thompson and Matt Hancock, and the focus there was very much around the prevention agenda, social prescribing, the delivery of services on a place-based approach, and joining up and collaboration. So I think that feels to me like the theme of the challenge going forward is how we all come together to do that, and do that within what are challenging budgets, and look at how we manage those budgets innovatively and differently going forward. And we're doing some local work on that, linked back to the unpicking of the sort of the demographics of each area to understand truly where the support is needed. But obviously where you can make things commercial, you do that too.
And we already mentioned it, but it's so in so many different industries across the economy, in public and private. The ability to understand the demographics and the data behind it is becoming increasingly important, and it'll only help the agenda. Indeed, prevention is better than cure, and that's the best, and that's the best way. The key to it is through that data. But since you brought up Matt Hancock, he may well still be the Health Secretary. In a couple of weeks, we speak in the midst of a general election, which has nicely ruined Christmas for everybody. But if you were, and I'll put you on the spot, if you were Secretary of State for, the afternoon perhaps, and you had a magic wand, what is it you would do that you think would be of great help to the sector?
Wow, that is a question.
I know.
You have to put me on the spot. I think it would be to take that strand of prevention forward and place health, wellbeing and physical activity at the heart of everything that is commissioned, particularly on a sort of public sector locality basis. And I think sometimes over the years things have been re-procured without maybe truly understanding the full importance that a health and wellbeing outcome would have to it. And I would weave that into everything that is commissioned across the piece going forward, and see where that takes us.
I'm sure you'll be taking into account, looking very closely at that section of all the manifestos that will soon be coming out, and let's hope they don't disappoint.
Absolutely not, no.
Now, what I think it might be interesting to end on here, Elly, only because we are coming to the end of our time here. You've clearly done an exceptional job within the borough, and there are so many lessons to be learned from it. We could sit here for an hour and talk about them, but if you could pick one or two where quite evidently you've managed to show leadership and raise standards in your area, what are the key lessons you would advise others in different districts and areas of the country to take away from what you've done there in Chester and West Cheshire?
I think it's about understanding key strategic needs and priorities with all of your key partners. I think you can't do anything in isolation. I did sort of allude to that earlier in terms of frontline delivery, but I don't think you can do it strategically either. I think it's absolutely critical to sort of look forward and look ahead and say what are the challenges that we are faced with, and how can we tackle and address those properly and truly together, planning both for the medium term and the long term. And I sometimes think, part of the challenge of a local authority is that you are working on 4-year cyclical timescales, and you don't know what that's going to look like going ahead. But I think the challenge, particularly around the leisure, health and wellbeing agenda, which is a long-term focus and goal in terms of improving obesity, reducing health inequalities, and difference in people's lifespan, is to work together with that thought in mind. And I think that's what we've done in Cheshire West and Chester. We particularly work explicitly closely with the local authority, mindful explicitly of the relationship we have with them and their shareholder function, but we also work extremely closely with our NHS partners as well, to define the things that we need collaboratively and collectively in Borough. And we're taking little steps on a constant journey towards an end goal of improved health and well-being. And I don't really think there's any other way of tackling it, because the problems we have as society now have grown over time. They've been impacted upon by changes to technology particularly, and they're not going to be resolved overnight, but it's having that longer term focus on it, and coming back to having a longer term contract helps you to do that. You mentioned earlier on our contract runs till 2030, and at the moment we're actually looking at the redefining of our business model with our shareholder and investment into some of our assets within the portfolio to take us through to 2030 and indeed beyond in terms of provision of services to local people. So I think, to my mind, that is key. It's about the planning and the cohesive planning of that.
Well, I think a marvellous note to end on. Elly, I hope we can speak again very soon on this. I'm sure you'll have a very busy year ahead of you, no doubt, but let's find some time. Thank you very much for coming on.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan.
Thank you.
hope you all enjoyed our chat with Elly, and especially learning more about the challenges facing the sector and how the whole team at Brio Leisure are continuing to raise standards. If you haven't heard it before, coming up now is our conversation with the Parliamentary Review's co-chairman, Eric Pickles. Lord Pickles served as Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government in David Cameron's cabinet before receiving a peerage in 2018. Lord Pickles remains active as the United Kingdom's anti-corruption champion and the country's special envoy for post-Holocaust issues, as well as a keen vexillologist. That's flags to you and me. I hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoy speaking to Eric. Here it is now. Eric, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm sure you won't mind me reminding the listeners that you've been involved in politics, both local and national, for quite a number of decades. Indeed, before the days we were in the common market. Given your experience over those years, what thoughts have you had over the last few weeks and months about the current political situation the country finds itself in?
Situation is quite dire because we have a parliament that is by and large useless. It's like a bored teenager on a long drive, and it knows what it doesn't want, and it's so bored with Brexit, but it can't agree. So no matter what you put up, it's against it. Are you in favour of a referendum? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of remaining within the single market? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of No, I don't want to do that. No. And are you in favour of leaving without a deal? No, we don't want to do that. So it's against everything, but there isn't enough votes to be in favour of something. And it could be by the time this podcast goes out that Boris has started on the process of the bill, because we'll be voting on that today. But even then, what people don't seem to understand, this is not the end of Brexit.
Right.
This is barely opening the door of Brexit. We've got years of negotiations about trade agreements, relationships with Europe, putting down pieces of legislation. We get our agriculture, our fisheries, our financial services into place. Brexit is going to go on and on and on and on. I'm sure we are.
Now, the question is, I should actually remind listeners that we are talking on the day that the second reading of the European Control Act will take place. So, as we speak, we don't quite know. As, well, perhaps like the government front bench, don't know what's going to happen. You compare Parliament to a petulant teenager. What do you do to a petulant teenager to sort it out? Is there a chance that it will see sense and push this through this bill without wrecking amendments? Is there a chance it will vote for its own for a general election? How do you see this playing out at the moment?
The sensible thing will be to put this deal through, because I've always been of the view a deal is better than no deal, because this is just the beginning. In order to start the process of Brexit, start the process of the United Kingdom taking over powers that it's not really exercised for 40-odd years, the smart thing is to get this thing through now. But in a way, it's not about Brexit itself. If there was a free vote, this deal would have gone through. Mrs May's deal would have gone through. But it's about politics. It's about a Labour Party that thinks it has a chance, trying to make the Prime Minister, whether it was Theresa May or Boris Johnson, look as though that they are in office but not in power, of delaying as long as possible. There's a lot of talk about an election in the autumn, maybe back end of November, beginning of December, something for us to look forward to before Christmas. It's beginning to look less likely. It's beginning to look as though they might want to drag it into spring to get as far away as possible from the rather decisive moment that Boris came back with a deal. We have to remind ourselves that nobody thought he could deliver a deal, and it does quite shock them. And if you remember, all this process went through in order to ensure that we were left without a deal. When we have a deal, suddenly, oh no, it's not that kind of deal. We don't want that kind of deal. We want something different.
I think the vast majority of people in this country, whether Remain or Leave, now would be very satisfied for this to come to a amiable conclusion. And as you correctly just said, because when it does come to those in the opposition that claim to want this to end, and then introduce wrecking amendments that introduce new objections to it, the general public are getting quite frustrated.
But you've got to understand that quite a lot of people don't get beyond a small area within Westminster, sometimes cliche referred to as the Westminster bubble, and go back to their own patch. Now, by and large, everybody hates their MP, except when they're at home, doing the fairs, wandering around, helping people. So they, in a way, they're cosseted to that great, which I feel is coming as a tsunami of change.
You, of course, MP for Brentwood for
25 years.
Absolutely. What would you? I mean, of course, you resident there as well, despite being a proud Yorkshirean, obviously representing a good Essex seat. What would you say to your old constituents right now? You hang in there; it'll be all right.
Well, it's different when you're a member of Parliament because you've got to kind of toe the government line a little bit. So one thing I found now is I've got my weekend back and I say what I want, and I think I always say to our constituents is that it is pretty hopeless down there.
Excellent. Well, on that, I think, honest assessment, it's something I think the Parliamentary Review has always done quite well, talking frankly about problems, issues, and also not just good practice, but leadership.
Well, I always used to read it when I was a member of Parliament, because, what you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences, and I've always sort of found it quite a kind of a chatty magazine, but also you would see things that you would not automatically have come across. I certainly have attended the receptions over the year, and it's amazing the things you kind of pick up.
And I think it's important to stress it's not because politicians are uninterested, because honestly, as you'll know more than anyone, it's an issue of time. And to be able to have a channel and a platform where you can keep communication lines between businesses, schools and policymakers is so exceptionally important.
No, I think so, and it's important that it's beholden to nobody. People, pay to be part of the publication, pay for to be members, and it's a way of not being beholden to government, not beholden to anything.
Now, echoing the words, of course, your fellow Chairman Lord Blunkett has said, what some might not know, is that you started your political journey perhaps even further left than David Blunkett.
Oh, absolutely, I was a communist.
Now, what was it?
At the age of 14, I was bought the Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, and I read it from cover to cover. I tried to read it a few years back, and I just couldn't follow anything.
Oh, so I was going to say perhaps you might know the minds of the show front bench better than they do themselves.
From my position when I first joined, I would regard them as recalcitrant running dogs of the capitalist system.
Now, what was it then that moved you from radical Marxists to running the only inner city council controlled by the Conservatives in the 80s?
Well, I was very young, and I was fascinated by what was happening in what was then Czechoslovakia and Dubček, and the revolution that was taking place there inside communism, and the way in which he was repressed by Mr. Brezhnev, and the tanks and taking over. I was so angry. I'm 16, remember. I'm really angry. I thought, what's the most outrageous thing I can do? I'll join the Conservative Party as a protest. And I kind of sticked around, and my family thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened to it. I was Eric the Tory. And
I think you announced this quite grandly as a grand protest.
I did indeed, but I kept going down, and it was an exciting time. people were developing the ideas of what the Conservative Party should be. Selsdon man, even Heath looked radical. We had different ideas, and it eventually clicked. And at some point, I became a Conservative, and that was 51 years ago. I think I'm definitely 100% a Tory now.
Through and through.
Through and through.
Although I do know the story. Most people might guess that a dynamo Conservative like yourself would have perhaps a portrait of Mr. Thatcher or Mr. Churchill in their office. But who is it that you have?
I had Che Guevara. Which I always had them over my left shoulder of visitors, and they always used to you see their eyes going up and thinking, I can't possibly be it. Someone asked me if it was Desi Arnaz. I thought it was married to Lucille Ball. But no, the reason I did that was to remind me and to remind my officials that without constant vigilance, the cigar-chomping commies would take over.
I'm sure David Bunk was in the room to reply to that, actually. But in that long journey, you eventually ended up, of course, in 2010, doing something most Conservatives had never thought they would have to do, but in a coalition government with, of all people, the Liberal Democrats.
That's right.
Now, for something I think perhaps today more than ever, people and our politics seems to be almost wholly determined on how we voted in a referendum 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the most normal thing would happen after something like that would be the country would come together, and if anything, we're more divided. I mean, I thought working in the coalition, I'm proud to have been part of that coalition. I'm proud to have worked alongside the Liberal Democrats, who I think realised that, like all minority partners in a coalition, they would suffer at the polls.
Do you think we've lost the ability recently as a people to work with those that we might disagree with on issues more than we used to?
I'm not sure that's right. I mean, you can see various members of the Conservative Party working closely with Liberal Democrats and Labour to defeat their own government, but it's not a thing I think I would want to encourage.
Quite. And I should remind listeners, we are recording this in Victoria, just over the road at Cardinal Place, a fantastically new development site which wouldn't have been there without some of your legislation. What was the proudest?
I personally approved it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What was the proudest moment you think in serving Secretary for 5 years?
It's my actual proudest moment. We did a thing called Troubled Families, which was the first centre-right attempt to deal with poverty and to deal with difficult families that were causing a disproportionately large amount of call upon the state, and it was on the basis of tough love. It's on the basis of getting people into jobs. It's about dealing with the kind of the family as a whole, not just one or two individuals that were having a problem. And I'm pleased that it's continued.
And since, I should very much stress that since, of course, you're stepped down for being an MP, you do have your weekends back, but that's not to say you haven't remained very active and very busy. Of course, continues the government's anti-corruption champion, shone the harsh light of day over malpractice in the local government. Indeed, the Queen's speech we've just had includes some of your recommendations from 2016. I think a couple of things on that. First of all, are you surprised, I may imagine you may not be, at some of the backlash towards, in this country, introducing voter ID for voting?
It is absurd, and it's particularly absurd coming from the Labour Party, because it was largely Labour's vulnerability that got my interest in trying to do something about it. And it's a bit like saying, you're requiring people to show some ID, that this is suppressing voting. It's a bit like saying the post office is suppressing parcels because they demand to see some ID. I think they've got a bee into their bonnet that this is something like that goes in the state to repress it. It's not. It's about giving confidence to the system. Now, the Electoral Commission and foreign observers have warned us for such a long time that our electoral system is vulnerable. And it's to misquote John Major, we are really sort of old maids cycling to Evensong and Wellbeing. Yeah, I mean, it's such a basic thing. It's an important thing. And it was kind of interesting in some of the trials. They did a focus group with a bunch of young Asian girls. And they said they thought the process of a photo ID would actually give them a greater confidence in the fairness of the system. I make all kinds of recommendations to stop post and vote harvesting, to stop various fraud taking place, to stop intimidation at counts, to stop intimidation outside polling stations.
And I think you referenced it earlier, the Westminster bubble. A lot of the places where this occurs and the places where this does go on are places where perhaps many members, many people in the press don't usually go to.
No, they don't. We saw a YouGov poll that said the overwhelming majority, well in the 60%, thought this idea was sensible.
Yeah, and I imagine you're quite proud that recommendation is in the speech.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit frustrated they didn't do it sooner, but nevertheless, I'm very happy that they are doing it.
It's as if the government's time has been taken up by something else and we've not focused on anything domestic.
Absolutely.
But with a man, though, with his roots in local government, do you think, and how much you've worked with that report, especially looking at them carefully, how would you rate our current state of local municipal politics?
Local government's very good. I mean, local government, don't get me wrong, it's by and large corruption-free, and it does a remarkably good job. And it was, in truth, my worries about local government and that these measures were brought in. I don't believe the fraud is big enough to be able to take a parliamentary seat, but it is big enough to take a council. And if you are negligent, uncaring about the probity of the poll, you're likely to be equally negligent about the awarding of contracts to your friends. So it's all past that. But local government is a very enduring part of our constitution. I got a bit of stick because we had to take some money from them, but by and large they survive very well.
Excellent. Now, beyond obviously that work, you also support the British Envoy for post-Holocaust issues.
Yeah, sure.
I think it very dear to your heart. I know you've done some fantastic work recently, including with obviously former Shadow Chancellor from the Review, Ed Balls. Would you mind, if you could just let the listeners know what projects you are working on with that and really the importance that has to so many communities around the country?
Well, I used to be very unpleasant about Ed Ball, and he used to be very unpleasant about me. But I found working with him remarkably easy, and we've not had a single row in 2 years, and by now we're beginning to be able to finish each other's sentences. We're building a memorial to the Holocaust next to Parliament with a learning centre below it, and the reason why the Prime Minister chose that site is that it was David Cameron, and he wanted to ensure that when people left the memorial, they would look and see Parliament and recognise that it was the last bastion against tyranny. But more important, to remind people who work in Parliament that the legislature has a choice. It can either protect its citizens or it can oppress its citizens. And we do know that that it was a compliant legislature that brought in the Nuremberg laws. And at a time when there are parts of Europe that are seeking to rewrite their history and seeking to see themselves as only the victims of the Nazis, I'm determined that we should tell the truth in an unblinking way. We are, I suppose, at a critical crossroads when the last survivor is likely to be no longer with us within the next decade and a half. And at that point, we do know that history starts to be reassessed. I think it was Simon Sharma that talked about this. And he was referring to the French Revolution. And of course, most of the books written in the 1850s are the ones that have shaped our view of the French Revolution. But the difference is this, that slightly over 100 years ago, my grandfather Edgar grabbed hold of his Lee Enfield and walked out of a trench in the Somme and walked towards the Germans. And within a few minutes, most of the people he'd been brought up with, most of his friends were dead. Nobody doubts that he did that. But there's a whole industry out there that doubts that the Holocaust took place. So that's why it's important that we help frame that narrative.
And you reference as well, it's so important, especially at this time of history, of 7 years afterwards, that young people in schools get the correct education about it. How do we compare as a country in doing that compared to some of our European friends?
We I think, compare remarkably well, and particularly because we've got a mixture of things. We ensure through the lessons of Auschwitz that 2 pupils from every secondary school go to Auschwitz each year, that they have a preliminary meeting, a visit and a wrap-up. We ensure that Holocaust Day is remembered in January. Now, I can remember starting that, or I'm not starting it, but being part of a foot soldier of people that put it together. And, it was like one man and a dog, but now it's quite a massive, it's a massive event. So I think we are quite good at remembering that. I think where we perhaps do need to have a wider understanding is beyond the death camps. And we need to kind of understand the Einsatzgruppen, which was the roving murder squads, how important they were. You were more likely to have been shot in a ditch than to end up in a death camp. The hinterland of that is Lithuania, where I was last week talking to colleagues, and through Belarus and the Ukraine. And it's really important that we ensure that we register where those death sites are.
And I think certainly, and I'm going to sit down next to speak, which hopefully won't be too long away. It's something I think we'd be very happy to keep updates on how that project is going, because it's so important and people do need to be aware of it. Looking to the future, though, I imagine you were actually very content and happy. The former Prime Minister, friend and colleague David Cameron just released his book, and you're quite unscathed from it.
I can't. He was very nice about it. I even bought the audio version because he was reading it, and he obviously, but there was a fair bit of affection, and I'm rather glad they left out one or two of the other embarrassing things.
Maybe another time. Yeah. But it's important, I think, and I'm conscious of the time. But I think it's important that today people have become so perhaps caught up in what's happening in this country regarding Brexit. Looking to the future, what would you say that it's a positive thing that this country has to look forward to?
Well, we're a large trading nation. We're a large economy. We're a liberal democracy, and it would be good to get through Brexit over the coming years. And it would be good to start to look at some of the social issues that we need to tackle. Those have been left behind by our economic progress. And it would be good to see some solid investment in this country, both in terms of its infrastructure, but also in terms of the way it operates as a democracy.
And I know there's going to be a huge focus of the next review. Rob Pickles, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
As always, it's been a pleasure interviewing and learning from our guests. I hope you've all enjoyed listening. Until next time, I'm off to the Buckingham Arms to raise a glass to raising standards. Goodbye.
Thank you very much for listening to our podcast. You can find every episode on iTunes, YouTube, and Spotify. The views expressed by guests in each podcast are their own. They do not represent the opinions of the Parliamentary Review, Westminster Publications, Lord Pickles, Lord Blunkett, David Curry, or any other guests on the podcast. If you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Review, please visit our website at www.theparliamentaryreview.co.uk.